Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are finally here. It's MSI content time. We are done with all of the major regions. We are done covering every single game that they have to offer. It's time for our first big international tournament of the year, the Mid-Season Invitational. I hope you guys are excited. I know I am. We've got a couple of videos rolling out here as previews for MSI, and kicking that off, it's of course going to be the meta report that I do before every international tournament. This is going to be me going over what I expect to see at the tournament, kind of giving you guys expectations for what we can see at the tournament. Now, I'm not always right about all of these, if only just because there are some weird intricacies about what pros like over what I think is generally strong in the meta, or what, you know, is strong in solo queue, or what the kinds of changes that matter and the kinds of changes that don't matter. But we've been very successful for the most part in the past couple of years when we've done this video for both Worlds and MSI. We're going to be going over the patch changes. It's going to be the buffs and the nerfs going from 14.7 to 14.8. And of course, I will be going through all 5 positions, talking about the champions I expect to see the most and the champions you can expect to see relatively frequently as well. Also throw out some honorable mentions that I don't have listed on any of the graphics, just because we're probably going to see them a couple of times as counter picks or in certain situations. But for the most part, we're going to be staying to the champions that I think will be more meta-defining, if you will. So I hope you guys are excited. I know I am. Let's jump right into the content. I don't want to waste too much time at the beginning here. Of course, in these meta report videos, we talk about the changes first and foremost, the buffs and the nerfs. And we're going to start, of course, with the champion buffs, the champions that got at least a little bit stronger moving into this patch, notably, at least in my mind. There were a lot on this patch, and it's very interesting because I do think this really kind of changes how you want to view what the meta is going to look like in 14.8, specifically in the mid lane, as we can probably see. But there were a lot of small changes that I think will impact champions, but how much they're going to impact their play rate or their viability, I think is definitely going to be intriguing. We're going to go through all of them at least relatively quickly here. I'll talk about whether or not I think it's going to affect how much they are played at the pro level. We'll start in the top left here with LeBlanc. She got a little bit of extra damage on her Q, but more notably, I think she got a cooldown buff for her W in the early game. Now, I think this actually will impact this champion quite a bit. I think her trading in the early game is just significantly better. With that W up a lot more often, you can just be a lot more aggressive, and honestly, the trading patterns just become a lot easier. You don't really have to think as much when you're playing LeBlanc, which is generally a positive. LeBlanc also notoriously kind of known as a champion that will be in pro play regardless of her strength, so her receiving a buff right before MSI, especially, you know, with a player like Cream at the tournament, or even players like Chovy at the tournament, like that have played a lot of LeBlanc in the past, I expect to at least see her a bit, and I do think this change will matter. I do think the W cooldown buff is a little bit stronger than like the extra damage on the Q, which I think is just kind of inconsequential in trades overall, but I do expect this to actually increase her play rate at the pro level. You've got Ryze getting a buff as well, and this is just kind of stacking atop of a lot of buffs that Ryze has received over the past month or so, maybe 2 months, really. Like, he has just been getting buff after buff after buff to try to get him into a more playable state. He got a buff to his slow on his W, about 15%, if I remember correctly, and he also got a buff to the cooldown on the W, I think 2 seconds at rank 1. Both of these are actually pretty impactful, and especially adding that on to some of the other changes that he's gotten in the last couple of weeks. Like, again, Ryze is one of those champions where, like, Faker's at this tournament. You're telling me that a strong Ryze isn't going to be picked by Faker in an important moment? Like, this is a champion that could very well sneak his way into some important matches in this tournament, if only because now, again, his early game is just a lot more reliable. You have a lot more ability to kind of play these ganks. You have the slow being a lot stronger, which is just generally good, and you can do it more often. This is exactly what you want to pick Ryze for, and he's still going to be relevant in the late game because he's always going to be Ryze. Like, he's always going to do the things that he does, and so, again, maybe this is impactful, maybe it's not. I could see a world where it definitely increases his play rate, though, just because of the reliability. And then Sylas, kind of an interesting change here. This is both a mid lane and a jungle change. I know it's more of a direct jungle change, but it does impact his viability in the mid lane as well. He got extra Q damage to monsters, and especially in the early game, I think this is going to help us clear out immensely. Like, he is going to be able to clear pretty efficiently now, and we've seen that in solo queue. We've seen people picking up Sylas and actually doing relatively well on it. What I think this really impacts, though, is his ability to be used as a flex pick, and if you are a flex pick in the meta, you know, look at something like a Rumble or a Nico right now that have been considered flex picks for a lot of this year. If you are that, like, you just generally have more viability and more potential to be picked early on. I don't think Sylas is bad in the mid lane. I think he's average, and there are a lot of good mid laners in the meta right now, but, you know, there is definitely a world in which Sylas being more viable in the jungle and being able to move between those two positions ends up giving him more play in the mid lane, if only because teams are more willing to pick him early on in drafts. And so definitely going to be interesting to see if it does change anything. I still think he's just fine. He's not like ridiculously strong, but I also don't think he's weak by any means. And so I don't really know if this is going to change too much, but again, I can see a world in which it does. And then, honestly, one of the changes that I'm the most sure is going to actually impact how people play the champion is Hui. I feel pretty confident that he's actually just going to be played more. He gets more magic damage on his passive now. I don't really know why they're doing this. Hui is already really strong, and I thought he was in a really good state the last couple of patches where he is relatively playable. You do have to be good at him, like you have to be practiced on the champion, but he isn't exactly dominant. Like, he can do a bit of everything. He is a bit of a jack of all trades, but he really is a jack of all trades, master of none, and I do think that was the intention for the champion. A bit more damage gives him a bit more of a clear profile as a potential late game carry, especially in some of those fights, but again, it's all coming from the passive, so it's going to be interesting to see if this changes anything. I would expect this to continue to make Hui one of the higher priority mid laners. He wasn't towards the end of playoffs in a lot of big regions, and I think a lot of that was just finding more consistency out of some of these shove and roam mid laners that can do a bit more in terms of the supportive options, but if Hui's just going to be dealing a ridiculous amount of damage, he's going to be relevant. And then finally, another mid laner here, Galio in the mid lane getting some changes. Movement speed got buffed, his Q cooldown got buffed. Maybe this matters, like maybe this tips the scales for people wanting to play Galio. It gives him more options in the early game to be able to shove and roam, which is generally obviously what you want to do with him, and that's definitely the meta right now, so it could introduce him, but there are a lot of champions that do that at a super high level, and I don't know if Galio competes with those champions in that same way. Like, yes, you can kind of spam your abilities a bit more, you can clear wave a lot more efficiently, especially if you're maxing Q early on. But I don't know if that's enough to say, like, I want to pick Galio over Talia. You know what I mean? I don't know if that's ever going to be a conversation in teams' minds. So I do think it will change something. I just don't know if it will change a lot. And then you've got some smaller changes, I would say, on the bottom. Some of these are impactful, and some of these I do think matter. But for one reason or another, I don't think they're going to impact the play rate of these champions as much as maybe the 5 that I listed on the top. But moving to the bottom side, we start with the Kali, of course, here. She just gets a little bit of extra base health. This is cool. Like, you can take an extra auto in lane. Like, perhaps this just keeps you a little bit more stable if teams want to go towards it. You do have a player like Cream at this tournament who is kind of known for his Akali. Do I think this is going to dramatically increase her play rate? Probably not, especially with LeBlanc getting, you know, more impactful buffs, in my opinion. I think LeBlanc is just going to be higher priority as that quote-unquote mid lane assassin. You know, we've already got, you know, things like Yone being pulled out in the mid lane as well, and so I'm not entirely sure that Akali is going to get this giant, you know, increase in play rate, but again, noticeable change. You've got Thresh getting a little bit of extra armor and MR. I don't think this matters, like, at all. I think this is essentially useless as a buff. I still think Thresh is in the same position. Teams have been playing him regardless of the fact that his numbers are really low, and I think that that will, you know, continue to be the case if they want to support that can be a little bit more of a jack of all trades, can be a CC bot, can be a little bit more peel-oriented. Thresh is generally just the call. He's always going to be meta because people have put in a lot of time playing him, but I don't think this makes him stronger in the same way that you would kind of hope with how weak he has been over the last year. And then Draven, I do want to say this Draven change matters. He's getting extra damage on the Q, especially early on in the game. This is definitely impactful, and I do think this makes Draven stronger, but the reason that I don't have this considered to be like a massive change for pro play is because Draven is still going to be the same champion that he is. He was already one of the strongest AD carries in the game, and now he's getting even more damage in the early game. That's really cool. However, there are just some teams that will never pick Draven. There are some teams that do not want to play around bot lane, that do not want to draft a champion where you have to invest those kinds of resources into him. Like, most of the, especially at this tournament, most of the teams just aren't going to be thinking about Draven. They're not going to be picking around that champion because they don't really have that kind of playstyle. Now, for the teams that do want to pick Draven, especially a team like G2 at this tournament, you know, I expect this change to get it permanently banned against those teams, the teams that have been willing to pick up something like Draven, because I do think it does dominate lane harder than any other champion, maybe with the exception of Kalista in the bot lane right now. And so I continue to think that it will be highly prioritized by the teams that want it and not prioritized at all by the teams that don't. Jarvan, Kind of a weird change here. He just gets an extra 1% on his passive max health damage, and it's fine. I don't think this is really changing how Jarvan plays. He still is a little bit outclassed in his own individual role by some of the champions that are just super common in the meta right now, most notably like Vi and Xin Zhao. I just don't really see an avenue for Jarvan to get back into the meta when you have champions like that that are just better at what Jarvan does. They're better at skirmishing in the early game. They do scale into the late game. They have pretty consistent CC, and their ganks are just infinitely better. Like, that's the real big problem with Jarvan right now, is you just don't have the same kind of gank assist that Vi or Xin Zhao have, and so you're never really going to be able to compete on that front. But I don't think Jarvan's a bad pick. Again, another champion that tends to find his way into the meta regardless of whether he's strong or not, because junglers just like playing him, and so, you know, we'll see if it ends up mattering, but I don't think this changes his play rate at all. Kai'Sa got some extra damage on the Q. They want to turn her into an AD champion. They want to try to turn her into this AD assassin down in the bot lane. I don't think her kit is ever going to be in a state where they can do that. If she's an assassin, she's probably an AP assassin, because you can fire off those Ws to get everybody down super low, and then you can start playing the assassin style, ulting to the backline when they have been chunked out entirely. Or if her AD is stronger, then she's just going to play as this backline marksman. There's really, I don't see a lot of avenue for her to be this like AD assassin, but they continue to try to push her in that direction. The buff, I think, just generally makes her better, but I don't know if it's enough to like push her over the top. I think she will get play at this tournament, but how much? I think it's just whatever, right? She's still going to be an AP champion in my eyes as a primary. Like, I think she's stronger AP than she is AD, even with this change. Jhin is getting some buffs as well. The attack speed on the passive, the damage on the Q. I think some of these changes are interesting. Again, kind of similar to LeBlanc. I think the Q damage is actually impactful. I think you're doing a lot more in the early game. This gives him more consistency, especially for these teams that want to play more weak side bot. You know, we talked about Draven, how some teams just do not want to go towards Draven because they don't want to put all that many resources into their bot lane. They don't like to play through that side of the map. On the flip side, there are some teams that just want to play through, you know, bot lane, and they don't want to draft something like Jhin that has to be this more weak side that isn't going to be this big carry if you get them super far ahead. And so I think on the flip side of what we talked about Draven, I think the Jhin changes are impactful, but they're not going to be impactful for the teams that just don't want to play Jhin. Like, this isn't going to change whether or not people want to play him. I do think he is stronger because of this. I especially think the Q damage increase is really good, but how much that ends up changing his play rate, again, I just don't think it's going to impact it that much. And then finally, I have Graves last here. Before the revert, I would have said that he was one of the more impactful changes here because the attack speed build just got so buffed because of the passive changes that he had, but the passive change to the attack speed got reverted. I don't know if that's going to be true for MSI. I imagine it will be. It is for solo queue, and so that just makes the changes essentially non-existent. I still have him listed here because he did actually get a crit buff on the passive here, which is something, right? Like, it's a change that I think will at least impact him in some way, shape, or form. But because that attack speed got reverted, I really do think that the attack speed build was the thing that got buffed the most when you went, you know, like basically full marksman on Graves, and you just don't really want to do that after the revert. So I don't really know. I don't think he's going to get any play at MSI. I don't really see any reason to pick him over something like Kindred or even the more consistently aggressive like bruiser junglers. I just don't see a meta reason to pick Graves after the revert, but those are the buffs. I think there are impactful changes, but as you can see from the way I've kind of talked about it, there are changes that I think may or may not to change the play rate. That's why it's so hard to kind of judge. I think champions like LeBlanc and Hui in particular are going to be relatively common at this tournament, and I could see a world in which, you know, Draven and Jhin end up getting more play. I could see a world in which a champion like Galio actually starts to get play, in which a champion like Ryze or Sylas starts to get flex play, right? I could see a world in which these champions start to get played more, but I could also see a world in which none of these changes matter at all, and the meta from the playoffs is exactly the same. Like, I think those things are both in play, and so, at least for now, I think there are some interesting changes, but none that I think are, like, blowing a champion wide open. But then moving into our champion nerfs now, and as you can see up on the screen, it is significantly less. We talked about the buffs. There were so many champions that I think that got changes or got buffs that could make them theoretically more relevant, but I don't really think there's going to be a lot of champions falling out of the meta, at least for strength reasons. This is essentially the same crew of champions that you've gotten used to over the past few months or so, past few years in some cases, but there were some changes that I think at least are kind of worth talking about. I just don't don't think any of these nerfs are nearly as impactful as the buffs will be, and obviously there's just significantly less of them. I'm going to start with the one that I do think will have the biggest impact, and that's going to be in the middle here on this graphic, and that's going to be Zac. Zac has seen a lot of, play in the top lane as this more reliable engaged threat coming out of the top side, can still be very tanky, doesn't have the worst laning phase in the entire world, has just generally been relatively reliable, I would say, for a lot of teams. A lot of players have played a lot of Zac going to this tournament. However, he had a severe nerf to his health regen. He's losing a lot, and I really do think this almost makes him completely unviable at the time. There are other champions that can, relatively speaking, fill his role, fill his void in the top lane. There are some champions that I think could rise in play rate just because Zac is no longer viable to take that role up, but I don't really see a reason to pick Zac anymore. I think when you're losing so much health over the course of the game, it really doesn't make your laning phase all that sustainable anymore. And also, you're really not all that pressurable in the top lane anymore. Like, your gank assist has gotten worse because you're going to be in worse positions. I just think this actually hurts him a lot. I think his trading patterns are just significantly worse, and now I feel like there is actually going to be some concern with picking him. And so if there is any champion that I think got nerfed enough to be taken out of the meta in a big way, I think it's probably Zac, specifically in the top lane. Maybe this doesn't matter as much in the jungle if you still want to use him as this flex pick, but nobody was really doing that at any of the top levels. He was pretty exclusively a top laner as we went further and further throughout the year, and I think this is a big nerf to top lane Zac, and so I would expect this to drop him off pretty considerably. The other two nerfs that are even kind of worth talking about at all, Azir on the left side here, again, his health regen was also nerfed, but his W damage is going to go down at least a little bit. I don't think this matters, like, at all, if I'm being entirely honest. I'm not even sure this actually adjusts anything. Azir maybe doesn't have the same kind of safe early game, but, like, come on, like, he's still going to be picked super heavily. I know people are talking like this change is going to change his play rate at all. It won't. He's still going to be one of the highest priority mid laners in the game, not only because teams have spent the entirety of the year practicing and playing with him. Even when he was disabled, he was immediately thrust back in as the #1 mid laner, but it's Azir. Like, are you telling me people aren't going to pick Azir just because his W cooldowns or his W damage is a little bit worse? No, like, they are going to pick Azir. This isn't going to change his play rate, in my opinion. And the Zeri change is barely even worth mentioning. She got a base health nerf, whatever. Like, does this matter in any capacity? I don't think so at all. Like, she already wasn't trading in the early game. She already was picked specifically to be this weak side bot laner, and she's not even the premier AD carry in that particular role. She's still going to get played throughout this tournament sporadically, and this change essentially does nothing. There really aren't a lot of nerfs to talk about. The only one that's even consequential, in my opinion, is Zac in the top lane. But outside of that, like, Azir, Zeri, I don't think their impact on the game is going to change at all from any of the changes that happened on 14.8. And I really wouldn't expect anybody else to really fall off in a major way. I do think there are some champions that are going to take some of that play rate away, especially in the mid lane, as we talked about in the buffs. But at least for this patch, not really a lot of nerfs to speak of. But now that we've gone over the changes that are on the patch, the champions that were buffed, the champions that were nerfed, let's go position by position, talking about what I expect to see out of those positions at this tournament. There are going to be a couple of things here. I'm going to be going through all 5 roles: top, jungle, mid, ADC, support. I'm going to be giving a tier 1 and a tier 2 for each role. Tier 1 is what I would describe as the champions that will define that role going into the tournament, and, at the tournament, the champions that I think, at the very least, are going to be picked the most, if not the ones that are going to be picked almost exclusively. Tier 2 are going to be a group of champions that I think are versatile enough to be picked in a lot of circumstances, but maybe aren't as strong, in my opinion, or aren't going to be as widely considered as the tier 1 picks. I also will be throwing out some, like, tier 3 honorable mentions that are going to be picked as counter picks at least once or twice in the tournament, but I don't think they're going to get enough play, and they're not general enough for me to consider them on this list. And of course, we'll talk about why I consider all these champions as a part of that as we continue to go along. But we're going to, of course, start in the top lane with tier 1 here. I've got 5 champions in tier 1: Cassante, Aatrox, Twisted Fate, Renekton, and Rumble. These have been the 5 top lane champions that have defined the meta over the course of this year, and there really has not been anything that has convinced me it's going to be anything else. To me, the best top lane champion at the moment is Twisted Fate. I think he is the one that controls the game the most. And whether or not you think he's the most splashable, I think that's up to you. I don't think he's the most splashable, which is why he's not like the highest on this list. But in terms of just pure raw power, I think a lot of teams are still going to be focused on trying to play around the side lane pressure that TF just inevitably causes. He's very good in lane. He's very useful in the late game. He can just kind of do a bit of everything. Not every team is going to want to play that style, but TF is still going to do a lot and dominate a lot of the conversation surrounding top lane. K'Sante and Aatrox are going to be your more general picks. Renekton, obviously, in that zone as well. There's just not really going to be a meta where these three are not at some point relevant unless their numbers are just horrible. We saw Renekton get gutted last year, but for the most part, he's recovered. He's gotten, ancillary buffs over the course of the last year. He's been super, super viable throughout the whole year, and K'Sante and Aatrox are just always relevant. Again, what these three champions do is they have some very solid early games, specifically Aatrox and Renekton have a very solid early game without really sacrificing a ton of utility in the late game. Aatrox can still take over team fights. K'Sante can 1v9 in the right circumstances, even though he has been nerfed a bit over the past couple of months, and Renekton is just Renekton, right? Like, he's the best lane bully. He gives you a stability on the top side that you just don't really get out of other champions. They are always going to be the highest priority and the most played top laners, and I would very much be shocked if that changes at all. Moving into MSI, and then Rumble's the last one here. Just the most damage you can get. Like, there are going to be teams that prioritize Rumble above those other champions. I'm not sure if he's going to have a higher presence, but he's probably going to have the highest ban rate, I would say, of any of these top laners, because teams that don't want to play against it are going to ban it, because it can cause a lot of problems. And so I think Rumble deserves to be in tier 1. Maybe I don't necessarily consider it as consistent as these other picks, but I do think it does kind of necessitate itself being in tier 1 purely by the fear of it that I think some teams will show. So those are the 5 that I think are really going to control the top lane meta. And then you've got some other champions here in tier 2. Of course, there are going to be a lot that I mentioned here because top lane is pretty versatile, but I've got Jax, Udyr, Gnar, Jace, Ornn, and Zac to an extent on this list. I talked about Zac before, so I'll quickly talk about him here. He's only on this list because he did get a lot of play in the spring split, and I do expect teams to be at the very least a little practiced with him, but honestly, I do not think he is good enough to continue to stick in the meta. I think this champion's going to fall out, and I don't think he's going to get nearly as much play as the others here, but everybody else here should not be a surprise. It's either very consistent as a weak side tank, things like Udyr, things like Ornn, even Gnar to an extent, or things that can really take over the game if you're in the right position. Every single top laner plays Jax. He can still take over the game. He's still going to be super highly prioritized and super heavily played, but he's also a flex pick into the jungle that's always going to increase someone's viability and versatility. We've seen a lot of junglers pull Jax out this year, so wouldn't be surprised to see him continue to have high priority. Similarly, I should say, Jace is also going to be on this list, has that mid lane flexibility. We've been seeing him less and less, I would say, in the middle of the map. I think that there are just better AD options right now for mid laners, especially because there are some really good ones out there, but Jace is still going to be picked relatively frequently if you want something more aggressive in the top lane, and you want to try and punish things like the Renekton and the Aatrox. I think Jace does that at a relatively okay level. Gnar, kind of to a similar extent, but just gives you that flexibility to be able to be a tank in the late game if you need to be, also very good engaged. And then Ornn, Udyr, you don't really need me to tell you that these are just like, play weak side, be a frontline tank in these front-to-back team fights. That's what your role is. And so, these champions are going to get play. You're also going to see some Darius. You're going to see some Olaf. You're going to see some of these more aggressive counter picks. I didn't want to put them on here because, again, they're not flexible. They're not variable in the way that they can play. You're not going to see a ton of them, but in specific matchups, you are going to see a lot of them. I expect at least Darius and Olaf to be picked throughout this tournament. There are a couple of other champions. Yone, I think, has the potential to be something that gets pulled out here at this tournament. There are options that I think, will be picked, especially because there are a couple of teams that I think do want to go for some more aggressive top sides, but for the most part, when you're looking at the champions that are going to get played the most, it's the big 5 that I had in tier 1, or the big 4, and then Rumble with his bans, and then, some scattered picks depending on what you kind of want to do in tier number 2. I don't think the top lane meta has really changed at all, with the exception of Zac not really being a part of it anymore. I think it's going to be a lot of what we saw in the spring split, which I think is going to excite some people. But then moving on now to the jungle, and moving on to tier 1 of the jungle here, it's a lot of familiar faces, and to me, a pretty clear trend developing, at least in the jungle, for what teams have been prioritizing, for what I expect to continue to be very popular at this tournament. It's going to be a lot of setup. You're relying a lot on other positions in order to carry games. Even as we get into tier 2, there really aren't a lot of designated carries in the jungle right now that are getting a lot of play. There are some that are getting, play here and there, but I think a lot of what we're we're seeing out of the jungle position right now in terms of how the meta has developed is controlling objectives and being able to be consistent in late game fights, or alternatively having great gank assist in order to set up either your mid laner moving around the map or your bot laner just getting super fed and kind of getting the game out of control as quickly as possible. And we see that here in Tier 1. My 5 Tier 1 champions, Maokai, Sejuani, Xin Zhao, Rel, and Vi. It's not always going to be 5 champions, by the way. I know top and jungle both had 5. It's just however many I feel are meta-defining. There could be more, there could be less, depending on the position, but I continue to feel like the tanks are at the top of the food chain. I know it's not necessarily played out like that in terms of play rate because, Vi has been by far the highest presence jungler in the game. I continue to say on this channel that I think Vi is overvalued, which is why she comes in at the bottom of this Tier 1 ranking, but she probably will be the highest prioritized jungler at the tournament. I just don't think she's all that effective from behind. I think she does a lot of the things that the other champions here do, but doesn't really have that safety net. I think point-and-click lockdown is obviously very valuable, but I think along the way we've overvalued Vi and her contributions in the early game. She's really not that phenomenal of a skirmisher, especially in a meta where Xin Zhao is going to be a little bit more proactive in the early parts of the game. She doesn't really keep up with that champion particularly well, and the problem with Vi that I think does kind of fall into this category with a lot of the other junglers, things like Rel. We were talking about Jarvan earlier. I think he falls into this problem as well, where if you don't get ahead early, you don't really do anything late. Like, you rely so much on your ability to be in fights to survive quite a bit. And if you're behind on gold, if you're behind on items, you're not really going to be able to do any of the things that make you good as a champion. And so Vi probably still going to be the highest presence champion, but I continue to think that it's an overhyped presence in my opinion. But I also do believe that Maokai and Sejuani are your consistent junglers that are going to get you kind of the results that you want, quite frankly. We've seen this in the LPL in particular. Teams that have been a little bit more reluctant to pick up Maokai Sej, teams that want to go more towards the Xin Zhao, the Vi, more commonly, they actually didn't do as well. It was the teams that were consistently picking Maokai and Sejuani that were winning games, specifically pairing it up with something in the mid lane that can be proactive in the early game, that can win, that can receive a lot of resources and do something with it. We talked a lot in the LPL in particular about the Maokai Tristana mid-jungle duo. I continue to think that that's a very effective, job and a very effective draft for a lot of teams, but Sejuani can fill a similar role. Now, I do think Maokai is definitely better than Sejuani right now, but I continue to think that both of them should be prioritized pretty heavily, and I really wouldn't see any reason for them not to be. And then, we've already talked about him. You've got Xin Zhao, you've got Rel, kind of two sides of a similar coin. They are picked in similar circumstances, but they do very different jobs. Xin Zhao obviously going to be more of a skirmisher in the early game. This is really when you want to try and just dominate the game early, where your mid game wants to try and, spiral out of control, where you want to control every objective and you want to try and take a lot of these fights when you want to play with something like a Talia in the mid lane. Xin Zhao is probably the most effective in that role. It's the reason I think Jarvan will not be particularly relevant, is Vi and Xin kind of do his job just a little bit better. I think Xin obviously can carry games, quote unquote, but most of it's going to be through good macro and good fighting in the early game. Falls off really hard in the late game, really has no team fight presence at all. Definitely the worst of all of these champions in that regard, but probably has the best early game of all of them as well. And then Rel, I honestly think Rel fills a similar void to Vi in a very weird way, where she is this champion that needs to be proactive early, because if she's going in the late game and just doesn't have the stats to be able to survive, she's kind of useless because she dies just really, really fast. But I still think her flex pick Vi ability is going to keep her pretty highly prioritized in the meta. I think these are the big 5 in terms of junglers. I personally would like Maokai to be the highest priority jungler in the game. I think he is the strongest and most consistent jungler in the game. Xin Zhao's kind of up there for me as well, but Vi will also be one of the champions that just gets a lot of play. But moving on to tier 2, these are more kind of up and down picks, things that I wouldn't expect to see as often, but definitely will get played at the tournament, or at least I expect it to get played at the tournament. You got Nocturne, Lee Sin, Poppy, Viego, Sylas, and Wukong. Sylas, obviously, we talked about earlier. He's really the only outlier here. I'm not sure how much play he's actually going to get in the jungle, but I think the fact that he can jungle is going to increase his viability, and so I think it's worth at least putting it here, because I do think he'll get at least 1 or 2 games in the jungle throughout this tournament. Some team is going to really like how he plays in scrims, how his clear speed is ridiculously fast, his gank assist is still good, and he's a very good team fighter. If you can get him ahead in the late game, he's one of the few AP junglers that I think actively can carry the game right now. I think that there is Nidalee and Lilia, like they're not as strong as they've been recently, and so Sylas kind of can take a void that's been in the meta for a little while now if he is actually good. So we'll have to see if he ends up performing well, but I'm sure some team's going to like him enough to at least pull him out in one game. But then you move on to some other picks that you've probably gotten pretty used to seeing. Nocturne just going to be consistent as this assassin carry coming out of the jungle. We see it paired up often with some of the other more teamfight-oriented mid laners, things like Orianna and Nico, and, we've seen a lot of those combos, quote-unquote, Nocturne diving in with Orianna Ball, or potentially Nocturne diving on top of a Nico ultimate. I'm not a huge fan of Nocturne in the current meta. I do think he's a bit overvalued in the same way that Vi is overvalued. I just don't think he's nearly as consistent as everyone would want him to be, but he is going to see play. Lee Sin is just always going to see play. There are a lot of Lee Sin players at this tournament. I would be shocked to not see him relatively popular. Same thing with Poppy, who just is good at everything and shuts down a lot of the very strong things in the meta. I honestly was shocked with how low the priority was on Poppy throughout the playoffs, because I do think this is a meta where she can do relatively well. I know her stats, her like actual numbers aren't very good right now, at least in comparison to what they were last year when she was one of the best junglers in the game, but her kit synergizes so well with, turning off a lot of the things that are good in the meta right now that I am kind of surprised that we're not seeing more of her. I would expect to see at least some of it. And if you do want to carry jungler at this tournament, it's probably Viego. Now, Kindred could fill a similar role. I could put Kindred on this list. I think that that's fine. Kindred's kind of tier 2.5, if you will, but Viego I think is more consistent as a carry. I would expect to see him more. He's just good in every phase of the game. His early game is solid. He can skirmish if he needs to. His mid-game objective control is pretty good. It's probably the weakest part of his game, but he can still do it. And then he can absolutely take over team fights if he starts to get resets. And so I still continue to think Viego is pretty much always going to be a pro pick so long as his numbers aren't completely in the toilet. And then Wukong is a late addition to this list. I'm not really sure how much play he's going to get, but he is still one of the better team-fighting junglers in the game. If you do want to play for that style, when you look at Tier 1, there really aren't a lot of, set-up team fighters in Tier 1. Maybe Vi can fill that role, and obviously Rel, to an extent, can fill that role, but they don't have the same kind of early pressure that Wukong has, and he does it in a much more aggressive way. He does fill a bit of a niche in the meta that I don't think other champions are filling right now, but again, I would expect him to be prioritized significantly less because Rel, Vi, Xin, these more aggressive bruisers are going to be a little bit more active. But, things like Lee Sin, like Wukong versus Lee Sin, they just offer very different things. So, perhaps we're going to see a couple of these champions, maybe even something like an Olaf. I know that Olaf jungle has been rising in popularity in some of these scrims that have been leaked, and I don't really know how that's going to translate into pro, but it's certainly something to consider. There are a lot of options in the jungle right now. Like I said, Kindred's also on that list. There are definitely champions that I think you can consider, but this is what I would expect. I would, basically expect it to be very similar to what it was, like I said, in spring, very similar to the top lane, except maybe a couple of additions here like Sylas and Wukong a bit more commonly. And then moving on to our mid laners, I think this is going to be the most expansive role to talk about here, if only because mid lane just has so many different options, so many different champions that you could potentially go to, and especially with the buffs that came in on this patch, I think there are going to be a lot more options than you're going to get for other roles. We'll start with Tier 1. This is going to be the biggest Tier 1 of any role, I believe. This is going to be 6 different champions that I consider to be kind of meta-defining that I would expect to see pretty regularly at this tournament. A lot of these I think are going to be, pretty standard traditional ones that you've seen and expected, but one kind of got bumped up here because of the changes. It's going to be Talia, Azir, Orianna, Tristana, Ahri, and Hui. Hui being kind of the late addition to this. I think the buffs that he did get on this patch are going to push him into Tier 1 for me. I think there was another champion that we'll talk about in Tier 2 that came very close to being a Tier 1 pick for me just because of the versatility that they offer and just generally, I think how much they're going to be prioritized at this tournament, but to me, these are the mid laners that I think really do define how mid lane is played right now, and that really starts with Talia. I've said it once, I've said it 1,000 times on this channel. Talia, to me, is clearly the best mid laner in the game right now for pro play. I think she offers a bit of everything. She has great early wave clear. She has a very solid laning phase, maybe not the most dominant, but there really aren't a lot of dominant laning phases in terms of the strong mid laners. Tristana's really the only one that I would consider that right now. Even in Tier 2, you're really not seeing a lot of lane phase dominance coming out from this position, and so Talia very much can keep up or surpass basically everybody else in that role, but she is the quintessential shove and roam champion. It's kind of what she was built to do, and that is the meta right now. Not only can she assist her jungler in ways that other champions just don't have the ability to do, but she can do it while getting herself a lot of resources. She doesn't really sacrifice a lot in order to do it. She can still carry in the late game, not only in terms of her split push and her macro and her ability to be anywhere on the map to respond to problems or create create her own pressure, but she's also like a lot of damage. Like she really is underrated as a primary carry. To me, it is very clear that Taliyah is the best mid laner in the game right now, and I think we've seen that throughout the playoffs, but there are other options. Of course, Azir still going to be prioritized heavily. I know the nerfs came in. They're not going to matter. They're not going to change the play rate. If they do, I'll be surprised. I would genuinely be shocked if any of the changes to Azir actually change the way people play him or the amount that people play him, but I would expect him to continue to be one of the best champions in the game. Orianna is pulling a lot of bans. Her presence is very high. I think she's solid, pretty consistent, not a dominant like mid laner in the same way that you're going to get out of Taliyah or Azir or even like a Trist or an Ahri. I think Orianna is probably the weakest of this tier 1 to me, but she's still going to get prioritized as that tier 1, so I do want to include her. Tristana is easily the best laner of every mid laner in the game right now. If you want to play with an AD mid laner, it's pretty clearly Tristana, and this is part of that combo with like Maokai or even Sejuani that I think really has been taking over in the playoffs, where we see these two paired together. Trist is able to get her own leads, and the jungler really helps with that because of the lockdown and the pressure that Trist just generally provides in the early game. You can still skirmish in the mid game because you've got a really strong mid laner, and then you're able to really control all of these objectives in the late game because you've got a Maokai or a Sejuani or something like that. I expect there to be teams that just consistently play this throughout the tournament, where Tristana is their highest priority mid. Now, it's also going to get banned a bit, and there are going to be teams that don't want to play that style anyways, because honestly, there are a lot of teams that just don't play Tristana, but I still think she deserves to be in tier 1 purely for the power alone, even if she's not up there in terms of presence. And then Ahri, again, just a very versatile champion, can do kind of the Taliyah thing, just a little bit less. She's going to be a little bit less damage, a little bit less reliability, but a little bit more CC, a little bit more of that supportive style if you do want to go more supportive in that aspect. You also have a ton of Ahri players at this tournament, you know, people like Cream, people like Knight, people like Chovy, Faker, who have played a ridiculous amount of Ahri. She's going to get prioritized as a tier 1 champion. And then, like I said, Hui kind of got bumped up here because of the buffs. I think he was already a good champion, probably would have been a higher, like an upper tier 2 champion if not for the changes, but getting even stronger to me just is like, okay, well, yeah, he is a tier 1 champion now. He's going to perform like a tier 1 champion. I imagine he's going to be pretty splashable. He is kind of a jack of all trades, master of none, but master of a little bit. He does a lot of damage. His CC is relatively consistent. He is a very good team fighter. Like, he can just do a little bit of everything, and so he is relatively valuable to teams. Even if I don't think he's like the strongest champion in the game, I do think the changes actually did help him quite a bit, and they're going to push him into tier 1 for me, but those are the champions that I think define mid lane. It's really all, you know, mages or mid lane scalers, and then Tristana, which I think is generally just how the meta has developed, how it's evolved. You've wanted a lot more AD coming out of the jungle position, and certainly hyperscaling ADs in the bot lane. But for tier 2, there are more options. Still not a lot of AD options, at least in my mind, but a couple of things that I threw on here just because they were high presence in spring. Things like Karma. You know, I'm not sure we're going to see a ton of Karma at this tournament. I think she's kind of been phased out of the meta after a couple of nerfs, but still worth putting it on there. Annie, I think, is going to get some play, but I just don't think that champion is all that good. And so, you know, I don't think she's going to perform super well when she does get play. And then something like a Corki. Corki is going to get play at this tournament. He has continued to get play throughout this year, but in the same way that I have gone to bat for Taliyah and said, like, yeah, she's one of the best champions in the game, I have gone to bat against Corki and said that basically every team who picks him would do better picking something else. And the champion right below him is something that I think just does his role but better, Aurelion Sol. I really don't see any reason to pick Corki over Asol. The shove is a little bit more consistent. Your early game is certainly bad, but so is Corki's. It's not like he's actually able to do anything there, and I think Asol is a better team fighter with less risk involved, and so generally I don't see a reason to pick Corki, but he is going to get play at this tournament because he's gotten play all year long. The champion that I considered putting in tier 1 was Neeko. Neeko is going to get tier 1 level presence, but I think a lot of that is going to be because she is a bit of a flex pick between mid and support right now. You know, we'll talk about her a bit later when we get to the support rankings, but she is a good pick. Very good early game champion, and, you know, does carry herself into the late game well because that ultimate is always viable and relevant. Her damage does fall off as you go further along into the game, but for the most part, her CC can make up for that. You've also got a lot of the new champions coming in here. LeBlanc, Ryze, Sylas, a lot of champions that received buffs on this patch. LeBlanc, to me, is very clearly going to get play. I think of all of these champions, I feel the most confident that LeBlanc is going to get a good amount of, you know, increased play from the playoffs. I think that she is just in a good position right now, and like I said, a lot of mid laners like LeBlanc, especially at this tournament, and so, you know, maybe she's another champion that could sneak her way into like tier 1 level presence. I just don't want to say that after she really wasn't there at all in the playoffs. Ryze, another champion that has just gotten buff after buff after buff, and his early game is a bit more consistent now, has the opportunity to potentially keep up with champions like Ahri and Taliyah. Maybe not super easily, but his movement speed's obviously great if you do take Phase Rush, and then I think the buffs to his cooldowns are actually going to make him a lot more viable in the early game. The slow as well, his trading patterns are going to be a lot easier, and so we could be seeing Ryze. You know, I'm not going to guarantee that you're going to see Ryze at this tournament, but I think he's worth noting. And then Silas, again, as we talked about in the jungle position, I think the fact that he can jungle is just going to increase his playability at this tournament in general. Teams that weren't playing him before are probably going to play him now, if only because he just offers a bit more versatility and confusion in draft, even if I don't think he's going to get played all that much in jungle. I think he's still a pretty good mid laner. There were other options here. Again, a lot of champions got buffed, but this was already a pretty comprehensive list, and I just don't even know already how many of these champions are going to get played all that much. In the tier 2, I think Aurelion Sol, LeBlanc, Nico, they feel very locked in for me as champions that are going to get a lot of play, and then obviously everybody in tier 1, but mid lane's pretty wide open in terms of what you can play. I didn't even mention things like Yone and Yasuo. If you do want to go, even Diana, we've seen throughout the playoffs, there are champions that are going to get lesser play and have options, have comps out there that are going to be dedicated towards playing them. I just don't know how consistent that's going to be. Mid lane is pretty open right now, and there are a lot of different, choices depending on what your flavor of the month is. But then moving on to bot laners, and this is a little bit more of a straightforward discussion. It's not really so much what champions are strong, what champions are most dominant right now. It's really just kind of what style you're looking for, what kind of champion you want to play inside your comp. As you can see as we go to tier 1 here, 4 tier 1 champions that all do drastically different things, that are all good in drastically different ways. You've got Varus, Kalista, Senna, and Lucian. These to me are clear-cut the 4 that we are going to see the most at this tournament. There are going to be others that end up getting brought up by certain teams in certain circumstances, depending on, whether or not teams want to play towards their own bot lane, but these are the 4 that I would expect to be kind of ubiquitous across the entirety of the tournament, across every team. Every team's going to be at the very least willing, I think, to pick these 4 champions, and they all do offer something a bit different. Varus is going to be your most flexible, your most viable, I guess, in any team comp. He just does a little bit of everything. He's going to be super stable in the early game. He's really not going to lose lane, especially, to things like Senna or Zeri, or Jinx or Aphelios that we're going to see throughout this tournament, but he's not going to dominate in the same way that something like Kalista would, and so you're kind of in the middle, somewhere there. You've got good range. You're obviously very high range and very difficult to deal with in front-to-back team fights if your team plays well. However, you are low mobility, and so you can be taken advantage of, but you can carry fights. You can fight around objectives. You can fight in the mid game. You can fight in the early game. You can play off ganks really well. You have a bit of CC. It's just very versatile. Again, that's really the word I would use to describe Varus, and it's the reason I would see him continuing to be the number 1 AD carry moving in to MSI. And then you've kind of got whatever flavor you want to drop in next. You've got Kalista, who's going to be your lane-dominant early game AD carry. This is a champion that you really only pick if you want to play towards bot lane, if you really want to decimate the 2v2 early on into the game, if you want to play for that 2v2. Kalista is the best in the game, or at least the most consistent at doing that right now, in my opinion. Kind of the opposite, you've got Senna, who is definitely your scaling option, probably going to be the most consistent scaler in the game. You've still got hyper carries in the meta. They're just not going to be quite as efficient as they were like a couple of months ago. Senna is now the hyper scaler of choice for a lot of different teams. I continue to think that she will be prioritized highly. She's not going to carry in terms of damage, but she is going to carry the front-to-back team fights in terms of what she offers. And then Lucian's going to be somewhere in the middle, not necessarily going to dominate 2v2 in the same way that Kalista does, but still is very strong in the 2v2 and really takes advantage of the mid game. This is for teams that want to skirmish, that want to play more aggro, that want to push the tempo, but don't necessarily trust their 2v2 to be as dominant. That's where I think Lucian ends up dominating or really kind of exceeding a lot of the other AD carries at this level. And so those are the 4, really depending on what kind of style you want to go towards. I think all 4 could be considered the best AD carry in the game right now, but that's my tier 1. Tier 2, again, it's the smallest champion pool, but the most variable in terms of like what I think is going to be played. I think it's very realistic to expect one of these tier 2 champions to kind of get into that tier 1 in terms of play rate if they are just prioritized higher than I'm expecting. You've got Zeri, Xayah, Aphelios, Draven, and Jinx. Again, you've got a variety of styles here that I think you could play. You've got some champions that are going to be a little bit more consistent in the early game. Draven, I think you could make the argument, is stronger in the 2v2 than something like Kalista. I just don't think it's going to be nearly as consistent, and I do think it takes more help from the jungler in order to get there. Obviously, if you get Draven snowballing out of control, the game is over, but I do think Draven requires more assistance from jungle, from mid lane, than something like Kalista does, and so we're going to be seeing teams pull it out, and it's going to dominate some games at this tournament just because it's Draven, and that's kind of what he does, but I don't think it's going to be nearly nearly as highly prioritized as something like Kalista will be in a similar role. You've got hyper carries here. This is kind of where all of the traditional hyper carries fall. Zeri, Jinx, definitely going to be the two that you're going to see the most. The Zeri nerfs I don't think matter at all, and so I would expect her to continue to be the hyper scaler of choice down in the bot lane, but Aphelios, Jinx, they can be playable. Jinx in particular, I think, has some very good matchups, and I don't think she's really all that bad in the laning phase. Kind of similar with Aphelios, I just think his numbers are a little bit lower than those other two. Xayah is also technically a hyper scaler, a hyper carry, but she is actually really good in lane right now. I think Xayah is undervalued, especially with how good Rakan is, which we will get into a bit later, but I can see Xayah very much moving into tier 1 if teams actually figure out that this champion can do as much as she can do. I think she's very strong right now, kind of a prototype to Varus, or kind of like a similar thing to Varus, where she can do a little bit of everything, and you can kind of play her in whatever role you need her to. She can be weak side bot, she can be strong side bot, she can do a little bit of it all. But really, I think it's just up to what your team wants to play. Again, the big kind of deciding factor for team playstyle right now in the meta is, do you want to play for a 2v2 in the bot lane or not? Do you want to draft something a little bit more passive in the jungle? Do you want to draft a Maokai and Sejuani and play towards a Kalista or a Draven in the bot lane? Or do you want to play Xin Zhao and try to pair that up with a Lucian? Or do you want a hyperscaler? You know, I think it's really up to team preference. There are options right now, and I don't think any of them are inherently better than the others. ADC is pretty wide open in terms of what you can pick. And then that gets us moving into our final position, which is, of course, support. And support is also pretty variable, a lot more variable than I think people are giving it credit for. Starting with tier 1, it's tied for the biggest tier 1 alongside mid lane, which I don't think a lot of people would kind of think of, but there are a lot of viable picks in the support position right now. So we'll go ahead and talk about it. I've got Nautilus, Ashe, Rakan, Renata, Tahm Kench, and Nami in tier 1. Now, to be fair, only 4 of these are really like actual tier 1s. Like Nautilus, Ashe, Rakan, and Renata, I think are tier 1 supports. They are supports that are very flexible, very splashable in draft. They can go basically to any team comp, however you want to play your style. All of them are going to be very good options for you. Tahm and Nami are on this list because they are going to be considered tier 1 alongside the 80 carries that they are going to be picked next to. Tahm Kench, of course, with Senna, and Nami, of course, with Lucian. They are going to be up there because those bot lanes are considered tier 1. As a duo, they are considered tier 1, but it's not really Tahm and Nami that make those bot lanes like ridiculously effective. They're not going to get picked outside of that, and so, you know, whether or not you want to classify them as tier 1, I think is up to you, but they're going to get picked as if they are tier 1. So I have them classified there, but talking about the big 4, Nautilus has just been very consistent. I've gotten a little bit lower on him throughout this year. I think he is very strong, but I don't think he's the best engager in the game. That to me goes to Rakan, who I think is very clearly the most consistent and the best engager coming out of the support position right now. If you are a team that wants to play a bit more of a roam-heavy style, that doesn't want to focus as much on the 2v2, I think something like Rakan is just going to be incredibly dominant for you. And in fact, we've seen that throughout the playoffs. It's drawn pretty consistent bans from basically every team that has played it. Same thing with Nautilus. You know, teams don't want to play against it, but they are a cut above. They are the 2 best engagers in the game right now. They both fit onto most team comps. They're very good in the late game. They're very good in the mid game. They can roam around, or, you know, they can play the laning phase. If you want to play aggressive towards your AD carry, they can facilitate that. They're just a little bit better moving around the map, in my opinion, but, you know, pretty good engagers. They're the 2 best in the game right now. And then you've got Ashe and Renata kind of filling similar but very different roles. Both are very good in lane. They both want to focus a bit more on the 2v2, whereas Rakan and Nautilus do want to move around a bit more. And I think both of them do enable your AD carry, obviously, a lot more. Ashe has been the very popular pick throughout this year as that big, like, really annoying support to play against. This is going to draw a lot of bans. I'm not exactly sure if it's going to continue to perform as one of the best supports. There are certain players that play it at a crazy high level, and there are certain players that do not play it at all. And so you're going to see a bit of variability on the kinds of Ashes that you get at this tournament, but Renata, to me, is the most consistent enchanter in the game right now, just does a bit of everything. Again, is very strong in lane. That ultimate can completely take over a team fight in the back half, and that's really what I think Renata separates herself with, is the fact that she is an enchanter that's very good in the front-to-back 5v5 because she can offer quite a bit. And so, you know, generally, I think she is always going to be prioritized as the #1 enchanter, but as you can see when we move to tier 2, there are others. But to me, top 4 here of Nautilus, Ashe, Rakan, and Renata in terms of what we're going to see, and Tahm and Nami will be up there if only because they pair so well with their given 80 carry. But moving into tier 2, you know, a couple of champions here that I think I'm not super high on, but are going to get play. And then, you know, a couple that I think are very good, just are not as versatile, are not as splashable, if you will. My tier 2 is going to be Rell, Alistar, Blitzcrank, Lulu, Thresh, and Neeko. All of these champions, you know, seeing at least a decent amount of play. A couple of these as flex picks, most notably Rell and Neeko. Rell is honestly more of a jungler than a support at this point in time. I actually don't think she's all that great in the support position. She really needs a bit more of an early lead in order to kind of do her thing in the late game, because because of the way they've tried to balance her in the jungle, and so you don't actually have this really strong early game anymore for her to deal with, and I don't think that that's necessarily the worst thing in the world, but I don't think Rel is like as good as Nautilus or Rakan or even Alistar in the same vein. I think she's probably the weakest of these engagers, but I put her on here because she is a flex pick and she will be prioritized accordingly. And then Neeko, who is a very good support. In fact, I would argue that Neeko is better in the support position than she is in the mid lane right now because her late game lack of damage or her lack of scaling doesn't affect her as much in the support position where you really are just there for the CC and the setup. And so I like Neeko a lot. Very good laning phase, very good ultimate. Everything we said about her in the mid lane applies to this, section as well. So just a good champion. And then you've got a couple of, picks that are just kind of out there. You've got an Engager and Alistar that I think is going to be kind of your default if Nautilus and Rakan are not available. That's kind of what we've seen throughout the playoffs. You've got Blitzcrank and Thresh if you want a hook champion. Thresh obviously offering a bit more CC, a bit more utility. Blitzcrank being the much more aggressive of the hook champions, but both can kind of function in the same way. And then Lulu's kind of your backup enchanter if you're not able to get Renata and you don't want to play Ashe. We've seen Lulu relatively frequently with the hyperscalers in the bot lane. I don't really think she's all that strong, but she is kind of the default next best enchanter, so she does kind of deserve to be on this list. But overall, again, very similar to what we talked about with the AD carries. Bot lane in general right now is really kind of around playstyles. It's not necessarily individual champions, individual, picks controlling the meta. It's really what do you want to do in the bot lane? Do you want, a weak side bot laner like Varus or like Senna where you can pick a Rakan or you can pick a Tahm Kench and you can kind of go do your own thing? Or do you want, something that is a little bit more focused on the 2v2? There are just options, and I think it's all going to be kind of team dependent on what they want. So generally just kind of an open meta in the bot lane, and I think that benefits a couple of teams in particular. All right, but that is going to do it for my 2024 Mid-Season Invitational Meta Report video. That's what I'm expecting to see. As you can tell, really not a lot different from what we've seen in the spring playoffs. I really don't think there were enough changes over the last couple of patches to introduce or take away any sort of major picks. It's really just Zac falling out of meta and perhaps Hui and LeBlanc potentially being a bit more common. Those would be the things that I'm most looking out for, but generally, you're just going to see a lot of teams play very similarly to what they played in the spring playoffs, which I think is a good thing. It's what they've been practicing for most of this year, but would love to know your thoughts and opinions. Do you think I'm missing anybody down in the comment section below? Do you think I'm missing a champion that could be played a lot more? Do you think I'm overvaluing champions that aren't going to see a lot of play? Would love to know your thoughts and opinions down below. Of course, if you enjoyed the video, leave a like on it. It really does mean a lot to me. Lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. We don't only post about, meta related stuff. We're going to talk about the teams as well. Of course, I'll be doing my full power rankings video where I'll be going from number 12 to number 1, talking about where I think all these teams land. I'll be tiering them. I'll be ranking all the players as well. That's going to be coming out probably after the weekend, but before MSI starts, and so I hope you guys are excited for that. If you are, hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when that video does go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. Hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all